There's a pattern in history that has reset civilization 5 times in the last 2,000 years. Not reformed it, reset it. Complete erasure of debts through hyperinflation, jubilee, or war. Ancient Rome in 33 AD, medieval Europe in 1347, revolutionary France in 1789, Weimar Germany in 1923, post-war Europe in 1953. 5 times, 5 different methods, but the exact same 6-stage sequence leading to total debt annihilation. Each time the debt seemed manageable. Each time leaders promised they could be repaid. Each time mathematicians showed it was impossible. And each time the debt was erased anyway, destroying the savings of ordinary people and transferring wealth on a scale that makes today's billionaires look like amateurs. Right now in 2025, global debt has reached 335% of GDP. That's $300 trillion in total debt, against $90 trillion in annual global economic output. The United States alone owes $36 trillion. Student loans, $1.7 trillion. Auto loans, $1.6 trillion. Credit card debt, $1.2 trillion. Corporate debt, $11 trillion. It is mathematically impossible for this to be repaid. We are in stage 3 of the same 6-stage pattern that has played out 5 times before. And history says stage 4, 5, and 6 follow with the precision of a metronome. The only question is whether the reset comes through hyperinflation that destroys the currency, a government-mandated jubilee that wipes out creditors, or a war that physically destroys enough of the system that the debts become irrelevant. This isn't prophecy. This is pattern recognition. Let me show you how it happened 5 times before, why it's happening again right now, and what it means for every dollar you've saved, every debt you owe, and every asset you think you own. Before we go through the historical examples, you need to understand what a debt jubilee actually is and why it's not optional. It's not a policy choice. It's a mathematical necessity. A debt jubilee is the complete or partial cancellation of debts across an entire economy. Not because governments are generous, but because the alternative is total systemic collapse. When debt reaches a level where it mathematically cannot be repaid, something has to give. Either the debt disappears or the economy does. Here's why this happens. Debt is a claim on future production. When you borrow $100,000, you're promising to produce enough future economic value to repay that $100,000 plus interest. When a government borrows $36 trillion, it's promising that future taxpayers will produce enough to repay that amount. But there's a limit. When debt exceeds the productive capacity of an economy, when interest payments consume all growth, when new debt is required just to pay interest on old debt, the system becomes a Ponzi scheme. And like all Ponzi schemes, it eventually collapses. The math is simple. If global GDP is $90 trillion and grows at 3% annually, that's $2.7 trillion in new production each year. But global debt is $300 trillion. If the average interest rate is just 3%, that's $9 trillion in annual interest payments. The economy produces $2.7 trillion in new value. The debt demands $9 trillion in payments. This is mathematically impossible to sustain. When this point is reached, the debt must be eliminated. Not restructured, not refinanced, eliminated. And history shows there are only 3 ways this happens. Method 1, hyperinflation. The government prints unlimited money. Debts are repaid in worthless currency. Creditors are wiped out. Savers are destroyed. Method 2, jubilee. The government declares debts canceled. Creditors lose everything. Debtors are freed. But the financial system collapses and has to be rebuilt. Method 3, war. Massive destruction of physical capital. Millions dead. Enough chaos that the debts become unenforceable and irrelevant. Every debt crisis in history has resolved through one of these 3 methods. There is no 4th option, because when the math says the debt cannot be repaid, reality enforces that math, regardless of what politicians promise. Now, let me show you the 6-stage pattern that leads to this endpoint every single time. Stage 1 is credit expansion creates prosperity illusion. Every debt crisis begins the same way, with easy credit that creates the appearance of prosperity. People borrow, spend, and the economy grows. Governments point to the growth as proof that the debt is productive. But it's not prosperity. It's borrowing from the future. Ancient Rome, 10 to 30 AD. After Augustus established the empire, Roman credit markets exploded. Wealthy patricians lent to plebeians, merchants, and even to other patricians. The Senate authorized massive public works funded by borrowing. Aqueducts, roads, forums, all built on credit. The Roman elite competed to outspend each other. Senators borrowed to fund gladiatorial games. Governors borrowed to bribe their way into positions. The economy seemed to be booming. More construction, more trade, more luxury goods flowing into Rome from across the empire. But the growth was illusory. The construction didn't generate productive capacity. The games didn't create wealth. The borrowing didn't fund innovation or infrastructure that would generate returns. It funded consumption, bread and circuses, entertainment and spectacle. By 20 AD, private debt in Rome had reached levels where most patrician families were borrowing just to maintain appearances. They owed enormous sums to creditors, but as long as new loans were available, they could keep spending. Medieval Europe, 1300 to 1340. After the agricultural boom of the High Middle Ages, credit became widely available. Italian banking houses, the Bardi, Peruzzi, and Medici, lent to kings, nobles, merchants, and even the church. Kings borrowed to fund wars. The 100 Years' War between England and France was largely financed by Italian loans. Edward III of England borrowed over 1.5 million florins from Italian bankers. That's equivalent to billions today. The credit expansion created apparent prosperity. Trade flourished. Cathedral construction accelerated. Universities were founded. But beneath the surface, the debts were accumulating. Kings were borrowing to repay previous loans. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks had lent so much to European monarchs that they were exposed to sovereign default risk. Revolutionary France, 1700 to 1785. After Louis XIV's wars, France was deeply in debt. But instead of austerity, his successors borrowed more. Louis XV borrowed to fund wars in Austria, Poland, and the 7 Years' War. Louis XV inherited debts consuming 50% of government revenue just in interest payments, but the economy seemed fine. Paris was the cultural capital of Europe. The nobility lived in opulence. Versailles hosted lavish parties. The credit kept flowing because everyone assumed France, the wealthiest nation in Europe, could always borrow more. Weimar Germany, 1918 to 1921. After World War I, Germany owed reparations payments imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, 132 billion gold marks, an impossible sum, equivalent to $442 billion today. The German government began borrowing domestically to make payments, to fund reconstruction, and to avoid the political pain of raising taxes. The economy initially recovered. Unemployment fell. Production increased. The credit expansion created jobs and growth. But it was all borrowed. The money wasn't real. It was future claims on production that Germany couldn't possibly deliver. Post-World War II, Western world, 1950 to 1980. After the war, the Western world entered the greatest credit expansion in history. The U.S. created the GI Bill, subsidizing housing, education, and business loans for millions of veterans. Europe received Marshall Plan aid, much of it extended as credit. The credit fueled the post-war boom. The economy grew faster than any time in history. Living standards soared. Governments could borrow cheaply because growth was high and inflation was low. The prosperity seemed permanent. But it was stage one, the credit expansion that creates the illusion, the borrowing that feels like growth. And stage one always leads to stage two. Stage two is debt reaches 250% plus of GDP. At some point, the borrowing exceeds a critical threshold. Economists have identified this threshold as approximately 250% of GDP, total debt to economic output. Once debt passes this level, growth begins to slow because resources are diverted from productive investment to debt service. Ancient Rome, 30 to 33 AD. By the early 30s AD, under Emperor Tiberius, private debt in Rome had reached unsustainable levels. The exact ratio to GDP isn't calculable because Romans didn't measure GDP, but contemporary accounts described debt levels as universal and crushing. Senators owed millions of sestertii. Merchants couldn't repay loans. Even wealthy families were insolvent on paper. The entire Roman economy was leveraged beyond its capacity to produce. Medieval Europe, 1340 to 1345. By 1340, European sovereign debt had reached crisis levels. Edward III of England owed the Italian banks more than his kingdom's entire annual revenue. France owed similar amounts. The banking houses were exposed to defaults, totaling more than 10 times their capital reserves. The credit market began to freeze. Banks stopped lending. Interest rates spiked. Kings who had borrowed easily for decades suddenly couldn't find new creditors. Revolutionary France, 1780 to 1788. By 1788, France's debt consumed 60% of government revenue in interest payments alone. Total debt was estimated at 300% of annual government income, not GDP, just government revenue, which was maybe 10% of the economy. That implies debt was potentially 30% of GDP, enormous for the 18th century. The government tried to borrow more, but creditors were becoming nervous. Interest rates rose. The cost of borrowing increased, which meant even more revenue had to go to interest payments. Weimar Germany, 1921 to 1922. By 1921, Germany's total debt, domestic plus reparations, exceeded 400% of GDP. The reparations alone were 132 billion gold marks. Germany's annual GDP was maybe 30 billion marks. The debt was impossible. The government kept borrowing from the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, to make payments. But the debt was growing faster than the economy. Stage two was complete. Modern global economy, 2008 to 2020. The 2008 financial crisis pushed global debt from 200% of GDP to 250% by 2010. Instead of deleveraging, governments and corporations borrowed more. By 2020, before COVID, global debt had reached 320% of GDP. Then COVID hit. Governments printed $17 trillion in emergency spending globally. By 2022, total global debt reached 350% of GDP. We crossed the 250% threshold in 2010 and just kept accelerating. The United States specifically, federal debt is 120% of GDP. Corporate debt is 45%. Household debt is 75%. Financial sector debt is another 80%. Total, over 320% of GDP. We're deep into stage two. Stage three is interest payments consume all growth. This is where the math becomes undeniable. When interest payments on existing debt consume all new economic growth, the system is locked into a debt trap. Any new borrowing just makes the trap worse. Ancient Rome, 33 AD. By the year 33 AD, Roman creditors were demanding repayment. Debtors couldn't pay. The entire credit system froze. No new loans were being made. Existing loans were being called in. Commerce slowed. Land prices collapsed because no one could borrow to buy property. Interest on accumulated debts was consuming the productive output of the empire. Wealth was flowing from debtors to creditors, but the debtors had no way to generate enough wealth to pay. Medieval Europe, 1345. In 1345, Edward III of England defaulted on his debts to the Bardi and Peruzzi banks. He simply stopped paying. The banks, which had lent more than their entire capital base, collapsed. The Bardi Bank failed completely. The Peruzzi Bank followed. The credit freeze spread across Europe. Without Italian banking, there was no source of international credit. Trade collapsed. Interest payments on remaining debts consumed the revenues of every kingdom. Growth stopped. Revolutionary France, 1788. In 1788, France was spending 60% of government revenue on interest, not on military, not on administration, on interest. The kingdom was borrowing just to pay interest on previous loans. This is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. King Louis XVI called the Assembly of Notables to approve new taxes to pay the debt. The nobles refused. They wouldn't pay to bail out a government they saw as corrupt and incompetent. The king tried to force it. The result was revolution. Weimar Germany, 1922 to 1923. By 1922, Germany was paying reparations, domestic debt interest, and reconstruction costs that exceeded government revenue. The only way to make payments was to print money. The Reichsbank began running the printing presses continuously. The inflation began slowly, then accelerated. Prices doubled, then doubled again. The currency was losing value faster than the government could print it. Savings were being destroyed, but the debts were still denominated in gold marks, which meant they were growing in real terms, even as the paper marks became worthless. Modern global economy, 2020 to 2025. The United States is currently spending approximately $900 billion per year on interest payments. That's more than the defense budget. It's approaching $1 trillion annually, and that's at relatively low interest rates. If rates rise to historical averages, interest payments could hit $1.5 trillion. U.S. GDP grows maybe $500 to $700 billion per year in real terms. Interest payments are consuming 100% plus of real growth. Every new dollar of economic output is going to pay interest on old debts. This is stage 3, the debt trap. We are here right now. Check. Stage 4 is system becomes unpayable mathematically. Stage 4 is the recognition. The moment when anyone who can do math realizes the debt will never be repaid. Not because people don't want to pay, because the numbers don't work. This is when creditors start demanding payment, debtors start defaulting, and the system begins to crack. Ancient Rome, 33 AD. In the year 33 AD, the crisis became undeniable. The Senate had passed a law requiring that 2/3 of every creditor's capital be invested in Italian land, trying to prop up land prices. But no one wanted to lend to buy land. Debtors who couldn't repay were being prosecuted, the prisons filled with debtors. The crisis came to a head when major patrician families, including senators, were exposed as insolvent. They owed more than they owned. The Roman elite was bankrupt. The debt was mathematically unpayable. Medieval Europe, 1347. After the Bardi and Peruzzi collapse in 1345, European kings tried to restructure their debts. They promised partial payments, extended timelines, offered collateral. But the math didn't work. England's revenue was $100,000 per year. Edward III owed 900,000 florins, roughly equivalent to 1.5 million pounds. Even paying 100% of revenue for 15 years wouldn't cover it. The recognition spread. The debt would never be repaid. Creditors stopped expecting payment. They wrote off the loans. The system was functionally bankrupt. Revolutionary France, 1789. By 1789, France's debt was consuming 100% of tax revenue, when you included interest plus basic government operations. The numbers were public. Everyone could see that even if France eliminated the military, stopped all public works, fired every government employee, they still couldn't pay the debt. Jacques Necker, the finance minister, published the numbers trying to force tax reform. Instead, it proved that the system was insolvent. The debt could not be paid. The Third Estate demanded the government default. The aristocracy refused because they were the creditors. Weimar Germany, 1923. By mid-1923, the Weimar government was printing trillions of marks per day. The currency was worthless. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Workers demanded to be paid twice per day so they could spend the money before it lost value. But the debt was still denominated in gold. The reparations were still due in gold marks. Germany would have to produce more value than the entire economy just to pay interest on the debts denominated in gold. It was impossible. Everyone knew it. The creditors knew it. The debtors knew it. Modern global economy, 2025. Right now, mathematicians, economists, and anyone with a calculator can see that current debt levels are unpayable. The U.S. would need to run budget surpluses of $1 trillion per year for 36 years straight to pay off the national debt, while also paying $1 trillion annually in interest. That would require tax increases of 50% or spending cuts of 70%. Neither is politically possible. Global debt of $300 trillion would require paying back more than 3 years of total global economic output, while also producing enough for people to live, for governments to operate, for businesses to function. The math doesn't work. We are in stage 4, the recognition. Anyone who looks at the numbers knows this doesn't end with repayment. Check. Stage 5 is political pressure for reset builds. Once stage 4 is reached, once everyone knows the debt is unpayable, political pressure builds for a reset. Debtors demand jubilee. Creditors demand protection. The government is trapped between two impossible positions. This is when the social contract begins to fracture. Ancient Rome, 33 AD. The Roman plebeians, the common people, began demanding debt relief. Debtors' prisons were overflowing. Families were being sold into slavery to pay debts. The plebeian tribunes, representatives of the common people, demanded the Senate cancel all debts. The patricians, who were the creditors, refused. They owned the debt. Canceling it would wipe out their wealth. The Senate was deadlocked. Riots began in Rome. Mobs attacked the homes of known creditors. The political pressure was building toward explosion. Medieval Europe, 1347 to 1350. After the banking collapse, European debtors demanded release from their obligations. Merchants who had borrowed from the now defunct Italian banks argued the debts died with the banks. Nobles who owed money to kings refused to pay, arguing the kings themselves were in default. But then something else happened that overshadowed the debt crisis. The Black Death arrived in 1347. Within 3 years, 30 to 50% of Europe's population was dead. The plague killed creditors and debtors alike. Labor became scarce. Wages rose. Debts became unenforceable because there weren't enough people left to collect them. The plague functionally canceled the debt through death and chaos. Stage 5 and 6 happened simultaneously. Revolutionary France, 1789. The political pressure for debt relief in France became revolution. The Third Estate, which represented 98% of the population, demanded the monarchy default on debts owed to aristocrats and foreign creditors. They argued the debts had been incurred by corrupt monarchs for wars that benefited only the elite. The aristocracy refused. They were the creditors. They demanded the peasants pay more taxes to honor the debts. This was the core conflict of the French Revolution. Debtors versus creditors, poor versus rich, and it would be resolved with violence. Weimar Germany, 1923. By late 1923, the German population was demanding the government stop paying reparations and stop printing money. Workers were striking. Communist and Nazi parties were gaining support by promising to cancel the debts. Adolf Hitler attempted a coup, the beer hall putsch in November 1923, explicitly running on a platform of refusing reparations. The political pressure was overwhelming. The government couldn't pay the debts and maintain domestic order. Something had to give. Modern global economy, 2020 to 2025. Right now, political movements on both the left and right are demanding debt relief, student loan forgiveness, mortgage forbearance, corporate debt restructuring, sovereign debt jubilee for developing nations. The left argues debts are predatory, that lenders exploited borrowers, that the wealthy should absorb losses. The right argues inflation is theft, that central banks debased the currency, that savers are being destroyed. Both sides are demanding intervention. Politicians are responding. Student loan forgiveness programs, expanded unemployment, stimulus checks, all forms of indirect debt relief through government transfer payments. But it's not enough. The pressure is building. Stage 5 is forming right now. Stage 6 is reset via hyperinflation, jubilee, or war. This is the end, the stage where the debt is eliminated, not through repayment, through destruction. The method varies, but the result is always the same. Creditors are wiped out. Savers are destroyed. Wealth is transferred on a massive scale, and the economy has to rebuild from the ruins. Ancient Rome, 33 AD, government intervention, partial jubilee. Emperor Tiberius, facing the political crisis, acted. He released 100 million sesterces from the imperial treasury as interest-free loans to debtors for 3 years. This allowed debtors to repay creditors using government money. Effectively, the government absorbed the debt. Tiberius transferred imperial wealth to bail out the debt crisis. The private debts were paid, but with public money. The treasury was drained, and the relief was temporary. Within a few decades, Roman debts had rebuilt. The cycle would repeat under later emperors with currency debasement. Roman emperors began reducing the silver content in denarius coins. By 200 AD, the denarius was 50% silver. By 300 AD, less than 5%. The currency was debased to inflate away the debts. This is method 1, inflation, debasement, debts repaid in worthless currency. Medieval Europe, 1347 to 1350. Death and collapse, war, plague. The Black Death killed 30 to 50% of Europe's population. The debt crisis was resolved through death. Creditors died. Debtors died. The survivors inherited property, but there was no one to enforce debt collection. Labor scarcity drove wages up. Serfs who had been in debt bondage left their lords. The feudal system weakened. The debts that had existed in 1347 were functionally canceled by 1350, not through policy, through apocalypse. This is method 3. Catastrophic destruction makes debts irrelevant. Revolutionary France, 1789 to 1794, hyperinflation, assignats. The French Revolution began with the National Assembly seizing church lands, about 10% of all land in France. They issued paper currency called assignats, backed by this land. The assignats would be used to pay government debts. At first it worked. The assignats were accepted. The government paid off creditors with paper backed by land. But then they printed more and more. By 1792, assignats in circulation exceeded the value of the seized land backing them. Inflation began. Prices doubled, then quadrupled. By 1794, assignats had lost 99% of their value. A single gold louis that was worth 20 assignats in 1790 was worth 3,000 assignats by 1794. The debts were wiped out. Anyone who had lent money to the French government lost everything. The currency became worthless. This is method 1, hyperinflation. The debt was paid, but with worthless paper. Weimar Germany, 1923, hyperinflation. In November 1923, the hyperinflation reached its peak. The Reichsbank was printing 500 quintillion marks per day. A single US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid in wheelbarrows of cash. They spent it immediately because by the next day, it would be worth half as much. Savings accounts became worthless. A lifetime of savings couldn't buy a loaf of bread. But the debts wiped out. Anyone who owed money paid it back in worthless marks, mortgages, business loans, personal debts, all erased. The people who lost were the creditors, the savers, the bondholders. The middle class was destroyed. In December 1923, Germany introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by land and industrial assets. One Rentenmark equaled 1 trillion old marks. The old currency was declared worthless. The slate was wiped clean. This is method 1, hyperinflation, total debt erasure through currency destruction. Post-World War II, Europe, 1945 to 1953, negotiated Jubilee, London Debt Agreement. After World War II, Germany, now West Germany, owed enormous debts from war reparations, reconstruction loans, and pre-war obligations. The total was estimated at over 30 billion marks, more than Germany's GDP. The Allies, led by the United States, convened the London Debt Agreement in 1953. They negotiated a 50% reduction in Germany's debts. Half the debt was simply canceled. The remaining half was restructured with very low interest rates and long repayment terms tied to Germany's ability to pay. This was a jubilee. Creditor nations agreed to absorb losses to allow Germany to rebuild. The US, UK, and France wrote off billions. The debt was cut in half by agreement. Why? Because they learned from Weimar. Crushing debt loads led to hyperinflation, extremism, and war. The London Debt Agreement was designed to prevent another Hitler by making Germany's debts payable. This is method 2, negotiated jubilee. Creditors take losses. Debts are canceled. System is reset. Let's map the 6 stages to today. The United States, the global economy. Stage 1, credit expansion creates prosperity illusion. 1980 to 2008, the Great Moderation. Credit cards, mortgages, student loans, corporate debt, sovereign debt, all expanded massively. The economy grew. Living standards rose. It seemed like prosperity. It was leverage. Check. Completed. Stage 2, debt reaches 250% plus of GDP, 2008 to 2020. The financial crisis pushed debt to 250% of global GDP by 2010. Instead of deleveraging, governments borrowed more. By 2020, debt was 320% of GDP. COVID pushed it to 350%. Check. Completed. Stage 3, interest payments consume all growth. 2020 to 2025. U.S. interest payments approaching $1 trillion annually. Global interest on $300 trillion debt at 3% average rate equals $9 trillion annually. Global GDP growth equals $2.7 trillion. Math doesn't work. Check, we are here right now. Stage 4, system becomes unpayable mathematically. 2023 to 2025. Anyone with a calculator can see the debt won't be repaid. $36 trillion federal debt plus $100+ trillion in unfunded liabilities. Social Security, Medicare. Total U.S. debt over 391% of GDP. Global debt, 335% of GDP. Check. Recognition is spreading. Stage 5, political pressure for reset builds. 2020 to 2025. Student loan forgiveness, calls for wealth taxes, MMT advocates saying debt doesn't matter, crypto advocates saying fiat is doomed, gold bugs saying collapse is coming. Both. Political parties promising spending with no plan to pay. Check. Pressure is building. Stage 6, reset via hyperinflation, jubilee, or war. Coming. We haven't reached stage 6 yet, but stages 1 through 5 are complete or nearly complete. History says stage 6 follows within 3 to 7 years of reaching stage 3. We entered stage 3 in 2020. That means stage 6 could arrive between 2023 and 2027. We might already be in the early phase. Based on the historical pattern, we can predict which method is most likely. Method 1. Hyperinflation. This is the most likely path for the United States. Not immediate Weimar-style hyperinflation, but high, persistent inflation, 10 to 20% annually for a decade. This slowly erases the real value of debts while maintaining the fiction that they're being repaid. The government doesn't default. They pay the $36 trillion debt, but they pay it with dollars worth 50 to 70% less than today. Creditors lose purchasing power. Savers are destroyed. But technically, the debt was repaid. We've already seen this begin. 2021 to 2022 saw 7 to 9% inflation. Real inflation using 1980s methodology was 15% plus. This is the beginning of Method 1. Method 2, Jubilee. Less likely in the US because it requires political consensus, but we're seeing partial jubilees. Student loan forgiveness is a jubilee for $1.7 trillion in debt. If this expands to mortgages, auto loans, credit cards, it becomes a broader jubilee. Globally, there's discussion of jubilee for developing nations. $300+ billion in African debt to China. If China forgives it, unlikely, that's a jubilee. More likely is coordinated default, which functions the same way. Method 3. War. The darkest option. A major war, possibly involving the US, China, and Russia, that destroys enough physical capital and kills enough creditors that the debts become unenforceable. This is how World War II functionally reset Europe's debts. Let's hope this doesn't happen. But historically, when debts become unpayable and political systems are deadlocked, war has been the resolution mechanism more often than we'd like to admit. The most likely scenario is a combination. High inflation, Method 1, combined with selective jubilees, student loans, some mortgages, combined with regional conflicts, not World War III, but ongoing instability that slowly erases the debt over 10 to 20 years. When the reset comes, and it is coming, ordinary people lose wealth in 3 ways. 1. Savings. If the reset is via inflation, cash loses purchasing power. $100,000 in savings becomes $50,000 in purchasing power. Bonds become worthless. Treasury bills return 4%, while inflation is 15%. You lose 11% per year. 2. Fixed incomes. Retirees on pensions, Social Security. Fixed annuities. They all lose. The payments stay the same but by half as much. A $3,000 per month pension becomes $1,500 in real terms. 3. Creditors. If you've lent money, bought bonds, have money in money, market funds, you lose. The debt is repaid in devalued currency. You get back 100 cents on the dollar, but each dollar buys half what it used to. But some people win. Debtors win. If you owe money, especially fixed-rate debt, you win. Your mortgage payment stays the same while your income inflates. You repay $300,000 over 30 years, but by year 30, that $300,000 is worth $150,000 in today's money. You effectively got a 50% discount. Hard asset owners win. Real estate, commodities, gold, productive businesses. These maintain value across currency resets. A house is a house whether it's priced in dollars, marks, francs, or assignats. Its value is its utility, not its denomination. Those who see it coming win. This is the most important point. If you understand the pattern, you can position before the reset. You hold assets that survive currency destruction. You avoid holding cash or bonds that will be inflated away. You strategically take on fixed-rate debt that will be erased by inflation. Based on the historical pattern, here's what you should consider. 1. Minimize cash holdings. Don't hold large amounts of cash or cash-equivalent assets, like money market funds. These will be destroyed by inflation. Hold only what you need for 3 to 6 months of expenses. 2. Convert to hard assets, Real estate, especially income-producing real estate. Commodities like gold, silver, agricultural land, productive businesses that generate cash flow. These survive currency resets. 3. Strategic debt. This is controversial, but consider taking on fixed-rate debt to buy assets. A 30-year mortgage at 6% is a gift if inflation runs 10 to 15% for the next decade. You're borrowing money that will inflate away while the asset appreciates. 4. Watch the indicators. Track real inflation using independent sources like shadow stats. Watch bond yields. If 10-year Treasury yields spike above 6 to 7%, that's creditors demanding higher returns because they see inflation risk. That's a signal we're entering stage 6. 5. Don't assume you have 10 years. The pattern says 3 to 7 years from stage 3 to stage 6. We entered stage 3 in 2020. We might have until 2027, or it might accelerate and happen by 2025 to 2026. Historical patterns accelerate as they reach conclusion. Be early, not on time. 5 times in 2,000 years, debt has reached unpayable levels. 5 times the debt was reset. Ancient Rome bailed out debtors and debased the currency. Medieval Europe had debts erased by plague. Revolutionary France printed assignats into worthlessness. Weimar Germany hyperinflated away debts in 1 year. Post-war Europe negotiated a 50% jubilee. Every time the method was different, but the pattern was the same. 6 stages from credit expansion to debt erasure. And every time, the people who understood the pattern positioned before it completed. They held hard assets. They avoided being creditors. They survived and thrived while others lost everything. Right now, global debt is 335% of GDP, 300 trillion in total debt. Interest payments are consuming all growth. The debt is mathematically unpayable. We are in stage 3, moving to stage 4 and 5. Stage 6 is coming. The only question is whether you'll recognize the pattern before it completes, or whether you'll be holding cash, bonds, and savings accounts when the reset happens. History is very clear about what happens next. The debt doesn't get repaid. It gets erased through inflation, jubilee, or war. And when it does, wealth transfers from creditors to debtors, from savers to hard asset owners, from those who believe the promises to those who understand the math. The pattern has played out 5 times, and it's playing out again right now. 6 stages. We're in stage 3. And stages 4, 5, and 6 follow with the inevitability of gravity. If this changed how you see debt, savings, and what's coming, you're starting to understand the pattern. 5 times it played out. 2,000 years of history, and it's happening again. Subscribe if you want to track the progression from stage 3 to stage 6, because when the reset comes, you'll want to have understood it before it happened, not